What a story. But now I have to ask, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love seeing how far our stories travel. And if you don't want to miss tomorrow's special episode, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. It's one of the most unbelievable stories we've ever told. See you in the comments and in the next episode. The guard who chose to protect more than just a palace. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, a relentless rhythm drumming against the stone pavement outside Buckingham Palace. Standing at his post, Royal Guard James Turner remained motionless, his ceremonial uniform soaked through, but his posture unshaken. After 12 years of service, he had endured worse than the cold London drizzle. But something about this gray afternoon felt different. The streets were quieter than usual, the usual crowds of tourists having disappeared in search of shelter. Fog clung to the palace gates, distorting the flickering streetlights and casting eerie shapes across the courtyard. A soldier's instinct told James something was wrong. Then, through the mist, he saw her. A young woman stood alone, just beyond the iron fence, barely visible through the curtain of rain. She wasn't moving to stay warm, nor did she carry an umbrella like the few remaining passersby. Instead, she stood unnaturally still, her gaze fixed on the ground, as if lost in thought or fear. Dark strands of wet hair stuck to her pale face, and in her arms she cradled a bundle wrapped tightly in blankets. At first, James assumed she was another weary tourist caught in the downpour, but then a sound cut through the rain, a baby's cry, sharp and desperate. James tensed. His sharp, disciplined eyes locked onto the bundle in the woman's arms as it shifted slightly. It was a child, but what truly unnerved him was her reaction. She didn't soothe the baby. She didn't hurry to shelter. She just held it tighter, her grip visibly trembling. Something was wrong. Over the years, James had seen countless beggars near the palace gates, some genuinely in need, others hoping to exploit sympathetic tourists. But they all had one thing in common. They asked for help, for money, for food, for shelter. This woman asked for nothing. She didn't even acknowledge the few people rushing past, huddled under umbrellas, their footsteps splashing against the rain-slick pavement. James hesitated. A royal guard's duty was clear. Never abandon post, never engage without cause. Breaking protocol could cost him his career. Then, the baby cried again. Louder this time, echoing against the palace walls. James inhaled sharply, his decision made before he even realized it. He stepped forward. James stepped forward, his boots clicking against the wet stone, a small yet deliberate break from the unshakable discipline drilled into him for over a decade. The rain soaked through his uniform, but his focus was locked on the woman standing across the palace gates. Then, suddenly, she looked up. For the first time, James saw her eyes, wide, panicked, filled with raw fear. It wasn't the kind of fear he'd seen in lost tourists or street beggars. It was something deeper, more primal, the look of someone who knew they were being hunted. James barely had time to register it before she whispered something that made his stomach tighten. "He's coming." Her voice was barely audible over the steady downpour, but the weight of those two words struck him like a bullet. Then she moved. The woman turned so fast it barely looked human, gripping the baby tighter as she bolted down the street. Her boots splashed against the flooded pavement, her silhouette vanishing into the rain. Instinct took over. James wasn't supposed to leave his post. Royal guards did not pursue civilians. But every fiber of his being told him this wasn't just a woman running in the rain. This was something else. Something wrong. Before he could fully process his decision, his legs were already moving. "Turner, report," a sharp voice crackled in his earpiece. His commanding officer. James hesitated. How could he even explain what was happening? That a woman carrying a child had fled, not from the rain, but from something unseen? That his gut screamed at him to follow? Then he saw it. Headlights cutting through the fog. A black Mercedes, sleek and menacing, emerged from the mist like a predator, slowing to a crawl along the same path the woman had taken. James made his choice. Possible civilian in distress. Moving to investigate. Before anyone could stop him, he took off after her. The cold air burned his lungs as he pushed forward, the sounds of London blurring around him, horns footsteps, the unrelenting rain. Ahead, the woman darted into an alley, her figure barely visible through the downpour. James followed, his boots splashing through puddles as he weaved between startled pedestrians. Then, the Mercedes accelerated. James barely had time to react before the vehicle veered sharply, cutting off the alley's entrance. She was trapped. James skidded to a stop just outside the alley, his chest rising and falling with sharp, controlled breaths. The black Mercedes idled near the entrance, its tinted windows impossible to see through, but he knew exactly what was happening inside. They were watching her. The woman, Jessica, as he would soon learn, stood frozen at the far end of the narrow passage, the baby still clutched tightly to her chest. Trapped. James could feel it now, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just a lost mother seeking shelter. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a hunt. A door clicked open. A man stepped out. Tall, broad, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit that somehow remained untouched by the rain. Even from a distance, James recognized the type. Calm, powerful, dangerous. He wasn't just muscle, he was control. The man took a slow step forward. "Miss Reynolds," he called out, his voice smooth, almost polite. "Let's not make this any more difficult than it needs to be." Jessica took a step back, pressing herself against the cold brick wall, her arms tightening around the child. James acted before he could think. He moved into the alley, placing himself between the man and the woman, his military training sharpening every nerve in his body. "I'd back off if I were you." His voice was steady, controlled but firm. The man stopped, tilted his head slightly. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "This doesn't concern you, soldier." "Wrong answer." James took a step forward. "It does now." The man sighed, shaking his head as if disappointed. "You have no idea what you're stepping into, do you?" He glanced past James, his gaze locking onto Jessica. "You know how this ends." She didn't respond. Instead, she did something James didn't expect. She reached into the blankets and pulled out an envelope, the same one she had dropped earlier. She tossed it forward, and as it hit the ground, the papers inside spilled out. James caught a glimpse. Legal documents. A birth certificate. And then his breath caught. The father's name, Richard Carter. The mother's name, Rebecca Carter. Rebecca Carter had died 8 months ago. And yet, this baby had been born just 2 months earlier. James didn't know what was happening yet, but one thing was certain. This was bigger than any of them. James barely had time to process what he'd just seen before the man in the black suit moved. Quick, calculated, deadly. The moment Richard Carter's name registered in his mind, James knew this wasn't just a custody dispute. This wasn't just a frightened woman on the run. This was a cover-up. The man, James Holloway, Carter's head of security, stepped forward, his expression still eerily calm. "Pick up the documents, soldier," he said, his voice smooth, almost amused. "Then, hand over the child. You don't want to involve yourself in this." James didn't move. His body tensed, every instinct screaming at him that he was standing in the middle of something far bigger than he could see. Jessica exhaled sharply behind him. James could hear it, the quiet desperation of someone who had been running for too long. Then the baby let out a small cry, its voice carrying through the alley, piercing through the steady drum of rain. Holloway's expression flickered, just for a second, a crack in his mask. And James saw it, not frustration, not anger, panic. Jessica took her chance. She grabbed James's wrist, so fast, so sudden, and yanked him backward, deeper into the alley. "Run!" The single word snapped him into action. James turned, already moving, his grip firm on Jessica's arm as they sprinted down the narrow passageway. Behind them, Holloway barked an order. Sharp, controlled. Footsteps thundered against the wet pavement as his men took off after them. James led them through the maze of back streets, his military training kicking in. He knew how to lose a tail, how to find cover in a city where every turn could lead into a dead end, or an escape route. Jessica kept up surprisingly well, even with the baby cradled against her chest. She wasn't just running blindly. She had done this before. She had planned this. Ahead, the alley opened up into a busy street, headlights flashing past. James spotted what he needed, a taxi slowing for a red light. "Get ready." Jessica didn't hesitate. As soon as they reached the curb, James yanked the back door open, shoving Jessica and the baby inside before diving in after them. The second the door slammed shut, he barked at the driver, "Go! Now!" The man didn't ask questions. As the cab lurched forward, James turned just in time to see Holloway step onto the curb, watching them disappear into the city. This wasn't over. James kept his eyes locked on the side mirror, watching as Holloway stood motionless on the curb, his face unreadable. But James knew exactly what was happening in the man's head. He wasn't giving up. He was recalculating. The taxi turned a corner, and the shadowy figure of Carter's enforcer disappeared into the city lights. But James knew better than to relax. They were being watched, tracked, hunted. "Where?" the driver asked, eyes flicking to James in the mirror. James turned to Jessica, who sat stiffly beside him, her arms wrapped tightly around the baby. Water dripped from her hair, her clothes, but she didn't seem to notice. Her focus was locked straight ahead, her breathing shallow, like a cornered animal waiting for the next attack. "Union Station," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. James frowned. "You're still planning to get on that train?" Jessica didn't look at him. "It's my only chance." James exhaled sharply, running a hand through his damp hair. He could walk away now. He could let her go, let her deal with whatever mess she was tangled in. But that wasn't who he was. And after what he had just seen, there was no way in hell he was letting her go alone. "That train isn't an escape," he said finally. "It's a trap." That got her attention. She turned, her tired eyes meeting his. "What do you mean?" James leaned in slightly. "You think Carter's men won't be waiting for you at the station? They know where you're going. They'll be watching every platform, every exit." He paused. "You're not just running from them, Jessica. You're running straight to them." She swallowed hard, gripping the baby a little tighter. For the first time, James saw something flicker across her face. Not fear, something else, something close to defeat. She knew he was right. The taxi jerked to a stop at a red light. James glanced outside, scanning the sidewalks. No black cars, no Holloway. But that didn't mean they were safe. He had to think fast. "You have evidence, don't you?" he asked suddenly. "More than just those documents." Jessica hesitated, then gave a small nod. Enough to bury Carter for good. James inhaled slowly. That changed everything. The light turned green. James made his decision. "Change of plans," he said, locking eyes with the driver. "Get us out of the city." What would you have done in James's position? Would you have broken protocol and stepped in to help? Or would you have followed the rules and stayed at your post? This story is filled with impossible choices, and we want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think is really going on behind Richard Carter's empire? Do you believe Jessica will ever be safe? Or is this just the beginning of something even bigger? And if you were in Jessica's shoes, carrying a secret that could take down one of the most powerful men in the country, would you run or would you fight? We love reading your insights and theories, so let's talk about it below. And if you don't want to miss what happens next, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's more to this story than meets the eye, and tomorrow's episode will reveal secrets that will change everything. See you in the comments.